Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of our double episode about the fight against the poll tax in the UK in the late 1980s and early 90s. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'd go back and listen to that first.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 alla mattina, appena alzata.
Before we get started, we just wanted to remind you that our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Our supporters fund our work and, in return, get exclusive early access to podcast episodes without ads, bonus episodes every month, free and discounted merchandise, and other content. So our supporters can listen to an exclusive bonus episode about this topic with more information. So if you can, please join us and help us preserve and promote our history of collective struggle. Learn more and sign up at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. We left off last week on the 31st of March 1990, after a police attack on tens of thousands of anti-poll tax demonstrators backfired, resulting in heavy rioting on the eve of the introduction of the tax on the 1st of April.
So everybody, all the police, the media, the government, all laid into the demonstrators. They all immediately blamed the demonstrators. The Labour Party, everybody had it in for the demonstrators.
As a reminder, this is Dave Morris of the Tottenham Anti-Poll Tax Group in London.
They thought this was a very strong, well-rooted, determined movement that was determined to defy the law. So that in their eyes, the establishment, everyone was a radical. But we're talking about millions of people. They thought they could just attack, insult the intelligence of the whole anti-poll tax movement. And I remember speaking to a journalist, TV cameraman at Trafalgar Square during the whole battle. And he wanted to know, what do you think about what's happened? And I gave my opinion. I said, you'll only put the opinions down that the media want to put over. He said, yeah, that's true, because I've spoken to 17 people, 17 people on this issue, and nobody is willing to condemn the demonstrators. Yeah. And of course, what will appear in the news that evening, ordinary member of the public or demonstrators will say, oh, it's all some troublemakers or something.
Indeed, in the wake of the riot, the British press was incensed and called on members of the public to turn on the rioters. They worked with police to identify suspects and appealed to readers to, quote, hunt the rioters and, quote, shop them, i.e. informing them to the police. The People newspaper, for example, displayed a mugshot of one man it described as a, quote, swarthy Latin or Mediterranean type with a high forehead, end quote, who was wanted for allegedly throwing a scaffold pole through the front window of a police car like a spear. But the propaganda didn't really work.
And the reality was there was massive support for people's right to defend themselves and against the police and against the government, because the tax was so hated, but also I think people realised that this was a provocation. I think the aim of the police and the government was to try to split the movement into respectable and radical. And, they thought it would work. It worked in terms of all the official establishment, the media and whatever, slamming the demonstrators, but also militant, or the All Britain Federation main organisers, who, of course, wanted to stay in the Labour Party, because that was their long-term strategy of trying to take over the Labour Party. They said that they would organise an investigation and name names of the people behind the violence.
As a reminder, Militant was the largest revolutionary left group in the UK at the time. Under huge pressure from the press, two militant activists, Steve Nally and Tommy Sheridan, who were both leading officials within the All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation, known as the Fed, appeared on news programmes to condemn the rioters. The general line adopted by Militant at that time was that around 250 individuals, quote, intent on causing trouble, end quote, had sabotaged the march. Sheridan said the Fed, quote, condemned it totally, end quote, and Nally said that they would, quote, conduct an internal inquiry to try to root out the troublemakers, which will go public and, if necessary, name names, end quote.
So the organisers of the demonstration were backed into a corner where they were condemning the demonstrators for defending themselves against police violence. This completely outraged everybody within the anti-poll tax movement. And the organisers of the demonstration had no contingency plans, no legal defence contingency plans if anyone was arrested, no solicitors' numbers, no advice on what to say if people were arrested, there was no pre-thinking about what advice people might need. But also, there was clearly going to be no follow-up because they were actually condemning people for defending themselves.
Now, in the end, this promised internal inquiry never happened, and no officials in the Fed did name any names. But with the help of the media, the police started identifying more suspects from the riot. In particular, they wanted to catch 300 people they claimed had been caught on film committing serious crimes. Now, in reality, all they needed to do was catch people who looked like those 300 people, and they used the riot as a pretext to raid large numbers of homes, particularly of people involved in local anti-poll tax groups. Officers smashed down doors, attacked activists, ripped flats and houses apart, and seized things like address books, pamphlets, and leaflets. Dave and others in the grassroots 3D network felt they had to support those arrested.
Some of us involved with the 3D network, who of course were heavily involved with the demonstration, we said we've got to do something immediately because I think 340 people got arrested at the demonstration, but 150 got arrested in the following weeks. There was this hysteria in the media and police raids, particularly around London, but all over the country. There was clearly going to be a really quite serious crackdown against the anti-poll tax movement. And we had to defend everybody that was arrested. So within 48 hours or something, we started having small meetings. We didn't know who had been arrested, where they were being kept. So we had to start going to all the police stations, courtrooms, to track people down, to give them information and contact numbers of solicitors. It was a real uphill battle, which could have been much better prepared for before the event. So we organised a defendants meeting pretty soon after the demonstration. About 60 people who had been arrested came along, and we decided to set up the Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign. This became really important. So the aim of the campaign, support those arrested, get them legal advice, raise money so that people could, if they were being held in jail or whatever without bail, they could get visits. But maybe as importantly, to get the whole anti-poll tax movement to commit to supporting the Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign. The All Britain Federation didn't like it. They didn't want an independent national body. And I think they called their own meeting, which only 2 defendants turned up to. And basically, they had to abandon their kind of attempts to create something in competition with the Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign. And gradually, over the following months, every federation of anti-poll tax groups signed up to support the Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign, which was really important.
Legal support for arrested participants is a vital but often neglected part of any social movement which wants to be successful. And the Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign set a great example of how to organise it.
It wasn't just moral support, it wasn't just money, it also involved the whole movement in tracking down people that had been defendants, witnesses to what had happened, and to keep the movement united was the most important success of the Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign. So the attempt by the authorities to divide and rule by splitting people into respectable and radical was countered effectively. So the whole movement remained united. I was heavily involved in that Trafalgar Square Defenders campaign for the following year. In fact, actually, we also, as a campaign, were supporting anybody that was arrested on local protests as well as Trafalgar Square, getting the whole movement to take a principled position that they would support anyone arrested in their local areas or even jailed, because some people were being jailed for non-payment eventually. And we thought it was very, very important that the whole movement supported those who were, subject to police or bailiffs' action for being part of the movement.
The Defendants Campaign put on dozens of benefit gigs to raise money, and they put together a team of solicitors. This lawyers group helped do things like gather police video evidence and pass it on to the campaign, which then went through them looking for relevant evidence for different defendants, and editing particular portions for use in different people's trials. The campaign also put on advice sessions about prison and held weekly meetings, mailing the minutes out to all of the over 250 defendants they were supporting. The Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign, like the movement against the poll tax itself, was also infiltrated by undercover police. You can learn more about that in the bonus episode with Dave, available for our supporters on Patreon, on the link in the show notes. Some defendants did end up getting convicted or taking plea deals, where they pled guilty to lesser offences than what they were initially charged with in order to get lighter sentences. But the campaign and their lawyers did help numerous defendants get off at trial. Multiple people ended up being found not guilty or having their cases dismissed because they were able to prove that the police blatantly lied and falsified evidence. A Mr. Haney was acquitted after police statements were proven to have been falsified, and also later edited to match his description rather than the actual perpetrator of the offence. Jurors in the courtroom burst out laughing when they saw the police notes, which originally described a man with a shaved head. After Haney was arrested, who didn't have a shaved head, the officer crossed that out and instead wrote in close-cropped hair. One defendant, a former miner named Michael Conway, was charged with violent disorder. He did admit throwing rocks at police, but he stated that he did so in order to protect the crowd from violent police attacks. He was acquitted by the jury. The day after the riot, the poll tax officially came into force, and so the most crucial phase of the campaign began: non-payment. Actually following through with refusing to pay the tax would be the most difficult and frightening part of the campaign for participants. So we asked Dave how the movement tried to prepare people for taking this step.
It was really important to get out mass information, encouragement, advice, support, neighbourhood by neighbourhood across the whole country, so that people felt part of something. It wasn't just something you read about in the media or had a few celebrities or leaders. It was something that had a mass grassroots character. So obviously we encouraged people not to pay. People started, challenging the bills, saying they'd not received them or they weren't the person that was named on the bill. If they didn't pay the bill, they got a summons to attend court, which would result in a court ordering them to pay. So there was a whole block the courts kind of campaign, because normally if people don't pay their local council rates or tax, they wouldn't attend court. They would just wait until they got an order through the post. So we were saying, well, let's go in en masse to the courts. So hundreds were turning up. Because of the scale of it, local councils, say in Haringey, they might try and deal with 3,000 court cases in bulk on a day. But if someone turns up, then they have to have a proper hearing with that person. Are you that person? Do you owe this money? Why haven't you paid it? So we were advising people to turn up. We were advising people how to challenge the bills, basically take as much time as humanly possible. And this was happening all over the country.
This was causing problems with the courts because there had never been the need to have so many court cases around non-payment before. As some examples, Bristol City Council issued 120,000 summonses to people. In Leeds, it was 110,000 people, with similar numbers in other cities. Councils were regularly issuing summonses to 3,000 people or more on a single day, which of course wouldn't be possible in a courtroom in the allotted time. Demonstrations were held by local anti-poll tax groups on court dates as well. In Warrington, for example, in June 1990, 1,000 protesters took over the court, forcing all cases to be postponed. In Southwark, in London, 1,500 protesters appeared at court, overwhelming the police. They refused to budge until the court agreed to adjourn all 5,000 of its cases.
So the entire court system was kind of clogged up and really struggling. I mean, seriously struggling. Something like 50% of the summonses, that were challenged or that people turned up, then they couldn't enforce them.
Local groups also worked with sympathetic lawyers to train their members to support non-payers in court, which they were able to do in some cases as Mackenzie Friends, a role in which non-lawyers can provide advice and assistance to defendants. We discussed this role in more detail in episodes 83 to 84 of our podcast about the Angry Brigade and their trial. A poll tax legal group was established, and in total, over 1,000 people in England and Wales were trained in poll tax law by the movement. They also produced dozens of easy-to-read leaflets and bulletins, as well as a book full of tips on how to disrupt or delay court proceedings, from anything like asking for water, demanding to see ID documents of everyone in the court, or even having people set off fire alarms in the building. Defendants were also helped by the incompetence of local councils, who didn't have previous experience dealing with this kind of situation. Medina Council on the Isle of Wight, for example, sent out court reminder notices using second-class stamps. This meant that by the time they arrived, defendants didn't get the advance notice period they were legally entitled to, so the court threw out all 1,900 cases, and the council had to go back to the drawing board. At this point, it's worth stressing that the movement against the poll tax was overwhelmingly a working-class movement.
The majority of people who weren't paying were people who couldn't pay. So the big slogan was "can't pay, won't pay." And really, that was the core of the movement. It wasn't necessarily the core of those who regularly attended the local groups. I would say it was a predominantly working class movement, and radical activists probably had an influence beyond their numbers. But the power of the movement was a whole mosaic of informal networks in pubs, in streets, in workplaces, which should never be underestimated. It's not just the people who've signed up to become a member of a campaign, but if it's a genuinely mass campaign, it kind of reaches very, very widely through informal conversations and word of mouth. And so when we had 500 street reps at one point in Haringey, it's not necessarily that everybody in that street was feeding back to that street rep, but somehow they became a conduit for, people thought they were experts just because, you're the street rep for the campaign, so you must know everything about the poll tax. Maybe they didn't know that much about it, but they'd volunteered to at least give out leaflets or something. So, and then people felt linked in to that kind of coordinated network, but the strength of it went far beyond the formal organisation. And I would say 95% of the non-payers were people who just couldn't afford to pay. I mean, for working class people, not paying a bill is quite a big step because that there's going to be enforcement down the line. Yeah, so, often you hear people calling, there should be rent strikes and there should be this and people shouldn't pay their electric bills because they're too much. This is quite a challenge for people. I mean, obviously, a lot of people just can't pay anyway, but then they get into debt and that leads to serious trouble. But this was for the first time, possibly in history, there was a collective non-payment widespread so that people felt confident that they can take part.
In some areas, local newspapers published lists of the names of non-payers, trying to shame them into paying. This strategy backfired spectacularly because organisers used them to contact non-payers to advise them of their rights. And some people who hadn't been included on the lists wrote into papers to complain that they were proud non-payers, upset that their names had been left out. In addition to the courts, local councils used bailiffs to try to enforce payment of the poll tax.
The next stage is that people will be sent orders that if they didn't pay within 6 weeks or something, bailiffs would come. Bailiffs were like, official thugs that would come around if somebody has a debt and basically say, if you don't pay right now on the doorstep, we're going to come in and take your goods, take your computer, take your whatever, but it wasn't computers at that stage, but, we will take them and then we will sell them. The council will sell them to raise money to pay your debts.
The situation with bailiffs was worse in Scotland than elsewhere. In England and Wales, councils can only send round the bailiffs after courts have granted liability orders, and then they can only enter your home if you let them in or if they find an open window or door. But in Scotland, sheriff officers can be sent to seize property without court hearings, and they're allowed to break into your house to seize your property and auction it off.
So there was a whole period of advising people about the powers that bailiffs have. If you don't let them in, if you don't open your door, and they can't get in, they're powerless. So don't talk to them, don't collaborate. There were sort of phone trees and mobilisations if bailiffs were in an area, because they would try to do, like 50 homes in one go in a particular area. People would have whistles and try to mobilise people, because probably a majority didn't want to pay the poll tax. Even if they felt they had to pay, they were still against it. So people would mobilise, and if bailiffs were spotted in an area, people would make loud noises and gather at houses that were being targeted. This was quite a systematic, extensive solidarity movement at the grassroots.
In Scotland, because of the different legal situation, where bailiffs could break into your house, physical defence of homes was much more important. The first attempt of sheriffs to raid a property in Glasgow was at the home of Jeanette McGinn. Over 300 people assembled outside her house, and the sheriffs never even ended up trying to get inside. Local anti-poll tax unions issued guidance advising people facing visits from sheriffs to move their cars away from their homes and move possessions to friends' houses. Sometimes they would help them move the goods as well. In Edinburgh, organisers set up a group called Scumbusters, with cars and CB radios to monitor bailiffs' movements and mobilise defence of homes. Activists in Scotland also held multiple occupations of sheriff's offices. In one instance, protesters demanded that sheriffs abandon an auction of goods seized from a local woman, one Mrs. Patton. And this was successful, with sheriffs abandoning the case. Other groups around the UK used tactics like telephone trees and spied on bailiff companies to identify their car number plates, which would be circulated in local areas. Some cars had their tyres slashed, and sometimes entire towns were blockaded. In the tiny village of Bishop's Lydard, with a population of fewer than 3,000 people, one day significant numbers of residents took the day off work, organised themselves into small groups, and built barricades, setting up checkpoints into the village to stop vehicles and ask them about their business.
I'm not saying it happened in every case, but it happened enough that the poll tax was becoming unenforceable. I mean, we're talking about millions were getting summonses, millions were getting bailiffs' notes, hundreds of thousands were getting visits from bailiffs.
Protesters were demonstrating outside the homes of owners of bailiff companies, and many of the companies were getting into financial difficulty, some of them going bankrupt. Bailiffs are only paid on a commission basis, so they only get a cut of debts they're able to recoup. So if they don't recoup a debt, they don't get paid, and they were not doing a great job of recovering debts. In Bristol, for example, in a whole year, bailiffs had only managed to get £54,000 from over 120,000 people who weren't paying. And in Scotland, a survey by Labour Research showed that after 40,000 visits to seize property from homes, sheriffs hadn't managed to sell the property of a single person. In Scotland, the government resorted to trying to deduct money directly from the bank accounts of non-payers. So organisers advised non-payers to withdraw money from the four major banks and instead use building societies or smaller banks. Bank bosses complained to councils about this, and so this option was never implemented in England or Wales. Another option for councils trying to get their money was wage arrestment, taking money directly from people's pay packets or state benefits. But this wasn't very successful either. Firstly, because councils had to get a legal judgment beforehand. Secondly, if they managed to get that, there were limits on how much could be deducted from someone's wages or benefits. So even if deductions occurred, they still weren't enough to cover the poll tax. And finally, many people refused to comply with the process. In order to deduct wages, councils had to find out who people's employers were. So they sent people forms demanding to know where they worked. Now, technically, it was a criminal offence not to fill in the form, but the punishment was only a £100 fine, which of course was considerably lower than the poll tax people were already refusing to pay. So in Scotland, after a couple of years of the tax, councils had only managed to implement wage arrestments for 14,000 people, and a little under 15,000 seizures directly from people's bank accounts. Now, this might seem like a lot until you realise that over 1 million people in Scotland were refusing to pay. So the only other stick authorities had to compel payment was imprisonment.
And then the next stage was if the bailiffs couldn't enforce the debt, they were threatening people with jail. And there was ways of, they had to have a court hearing, disrupt those. You can always pay at the last minute if all else fails.
So as a last resort, if people could afford the tax, then they could always just decide to pay it. But a good number of people refused to pay on principle and were imprisoned. And of course, those who just couldn't afford to pay were jailed as well.
I mean, some of the Trafalgar Square defendants had gone to jail, but we were also helping them challenge the police, account of what had happened. And many people who were arrested on anti-poll tax protests at Trafalgar Square or elsewhere were being found not guilty by juries. Juries were generally sympathetic, but in local areas, some people did go to jail for non-payment. So it was a complex, constantly developing movement.
The first person threatened with imprisonment was a 74-year-old pensioner in Northampton called Cyril Mundin. He was arrested by bailiffs in October 1990 and threatened with 14 days in prison if he didn't pay his tax. Local residents occupied the office of the city treasurer in protest, holding him inside for over an hour. In the end, a tabloid newspaper paid his tax, and he wasn't jailed. The first person actually jailed was a man called Brian Wright in Grantham, who got a 3-week sentence. Hundreds of people wrote him letters and cards of support, and hundreds more demonstrated outside his prison. Council officers were flooded with hate mail, and activists also visited politicians, including his local Member of Parliament, MP, and a government minister. Following the intervention of his local MP, Wright was allowed visitors in prison every day, and he got released after just 2 weeks.
Many people did go to jail. Not sure how many. I heard one estimate of 2,000 people.
We'll be right back after these messages. If you want to listen to our podcast without ads, join us on Patreon, where you can also listen to an additional bonus episode with more information about Dave's life, activism, and connection with our current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Support from our listeners on Patreon is the only way we're able to devote the time and money it takes to make this podcast. You can learn more and join us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. Chaos in the taxation system was mounting, and so grassroots campaigners wanted to up the pressure.
The unease began to grip the Conservative Party, and there were sort of mutterings against Margaret Thatcher. I mean, all around the world, the Trafalgar Square battle had got massive publicity, and that undermined the kind of Thatcher kind of Iron Lady kind of propaganda about the ladies not for turning and all that kind of stuff. So really the last gasp, apart from the local struggles and non-cooperation campaign, was the Trafalgar Square Defenders campaign was calling for another national demonstration because Conservative MPs were calling for demonstrations in central London to be banned, or at least the police have the power to do so, which they've never had. So we said it's really important to get back to a mass protest in central London.
The National Federation didn't want another mass protest. They wanted a symbolic march of just 75 people across the country, consisting almost entirely of members and supporters of Militant. But the Trafalgar Square Defendants campaign and numerous local anti-poll tax groups and federations insisted that they wanted a mass protest, which would also rally support for those imprisoned, on the 20th of October 1990, and the Fed decided that it wouldn't oppose such a move. Dave talks in detail about the debates and preparations for this protest and what happened afterwards in the bonus episode for this one, available for our Patreon supporters. The day before the protest, supporters of the campaign protested in 15 countries around the world, including Norway, Australia, Switzerland, Austria, and the US, and protesters in France occupied the British consulate. On the day itself, 25,000 people rallied against the poll tax, of whom around 3,500 people marched off to Brixton Prison, where many poll tax prisoners were being held. They were met by 3,000 police in riot gear, and they clearly wanted revenge for the March riot. They piled in, attacking the crowd.
At a certain point, the police just waded in with batons. I got truncheoned on the head. I had to go to hospital, and the whole demonstration was broken up.
This was despite the fact that Dave was clearly marked as a protest steward, wearing a pink fluorescent high-vis vest. Other demonstrators tried to defend themselves, and by the end of the day, an unknown number were injured. 135 were arrested, and 40 police were injured. But this time, unlike in March, the police weren't able to control the narrative of what happened, which was reported in the media. Because of preparation undertaken by the organisers, including putting together a video crew, which Dave discusses in detail in our bonus episode for our Patreon supporters, campaigners were able to show that the police were the aggressors who launched a premeditated attack on a peaceful march.
That was really the last attempt, I think, by the government and the police and the media to really undermine the movement. So it was announced that, at one point that winter, 14 million people weren't paying out of, something like 50% of the adults in the country weren't paying. The Conservative Party began to implode on the issue. In early 1991, the Conservative Party lost some super safe seats, with massive majorities were being overturned and they were losing to the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. And the general feeling was the poll tax, which had been portrayed as the flagship policy of the Conservative government at the end of the 1980s, was actually becoming, the millstone around its neck. And there was talk of challenging Margaret Thatcher to the leadership battles inside the Tory party. Some people were saying it's all down to the poll tax. We've got to get rid of the poll tax.
Opinion polls were showing Labour as being hugely ahead in national polls, 55% compared with 28% for the Tories. Although this lead was hugely reduced if people were asked if Michael Heseltine were Tory leader. Heseltine was a government minister who'd consistently opposed the poll tax. Eventually, with pressure mounting on Thatcher, the Deputy Prime Minister, Geoffrey Howe, attacked her position on Europe and on her autocratic style. Sensing blood in the water, other leading Tories joined in, attacking her and the poll tax. And so the party was forced to hold a leadership election between Thatcher and Heseltine, with the poll tax being the primary issue at play. Thatcher did come out ahead of Heseltine in the first ballot, but she didn't win an outright majority, which dealt a death blow to her leadership. On the 20th of November 1990, she was forced to resign. John Major was elected to replace her, and he appointed Heseltine to be in charge of the poll tax and to undertake a review of the policy, but importantly, he was not authorised to abolish it. So, the campaign against it continued. In a desperate attempt to save the tax, the Conservatives tried to lessen the blow to taxpayers by offering rebates to half of all payers, which was a move which was mocked by the newspaper of business, the Financial Times, pointing out that even Major admitted that, quote, "There must be something wrong with a tax which starts with the principle that everyone should pay and ends with a system under which 18 million out of 36 million people have to be offered rebates." End quote. Then they announced that they would reduce the poll tax for everyone by £140 per person, with the difference to be covered by an increase in sales tax, VAT, of 2.5 percentage points. But this wasn't enough for opponents of the poll tax, who continued to insist it be abolished completely. In early March 1991, the Tories suffered another devastating by-election loss, losing their fourth safest seat in the country to the Liberal Democrats, with the poll tax clearly shown as the overriding issue at stake. Organisers planned another mass protest to coincide with the anniversary of the Trafalgar Square riot.
So we planned an anniversary demonstration. The Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign and the All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation planned an anniversary demonstration. It was March the 23rd, 1991. Because don't forget, councils were meeting to set the following year's rate all over the country. You know, it's the same thing again in the build-up to the next financial year. There were protests all over the country in local areas. So we said, of course, there must be a national demonstration through central London, not a rally as in October. And this was extremely tense. We booked Trafalgar Square, the Trafalgar Square Defendants Campaign. But this time the police conceded that the march should go to Hyde Park. I was involved with the meetings with the various senior police officers involved with the demonstration. And it was extremely tense. Nobody wanted to be blamed if the whole thing degenerated into a battle. And as it got closer and closer to the dates, it became a big political issue in the media and in Parliament.
In the end, though, the demonstration proved to be unnecessary.
2 days before the anniversary demonstration, John Major announced the poll tax was going to be scrapped. He said it's unenforceable, it's going to be scrapped.
Michael Heseltine stated that the poll tax would be replaced in 1993 by a council tax, a banded tax based on property value, more similar to the old rates system. But of course, they did still intend to keep the poll tax for a further 2 years.
Following that, the poll tax administration kind of carried on, but, the stuffing had been knocked out of the whole administrative drive to enforce it. Councils couldn't cope anyway. The registration kind of system was in chaos. And eventually, what was announced was that if bills weren't, well, it wasn't so much announced, but we announced it, was that there's a statute of limitations. If the bill is not collected within 6 years, it has to be written off. So we were just calling everyone to hold firm, don't pay, and millions of people never paid a penny.
In Lothian in Scotland alone, in 1994, while the new council tax had mostly been paid, there was still nearly £124 million in arrears from poll tax non-payers, and the finance officer for the authority complained of a hardcore of people who still weren't paying. By the time the 6 years was up, councils in England and Wales had to write off an estimated £5 billion in unpaid bills from 4 million people. In Scotland, the debt didn't expire in 6 years, so the non-payment campaign technically continued up until 2015. Then the Scottish Parliament passed a law writing off the last remaining debt from the tax of around £425 million, in a move which was still condemned by the Conservatives.
I think that eventually, a couple of years after that victory demonstration, they had to bring in an alternative tax called the council tax, which was based on households and homes rather than individuals. So it was a big success. I'm not saying that the council tax wasn't oppressive, but it wasn't as bad as the poll tax.
Now, this touches on something which, unfortunately, people comment regularly on our social media posts about the fight against the poll tax. A typical comment says something like, then the poll tax was just replaced by the council tax, which was exactly the same. But this is just completely wrong. As we discussed earlier in part 1, the poll tax was a charge on every individual in a household. So a household of 2 parents and 2 children over 18 living in a small flat would pay 4 times as much as a billionaire living in a mansion. So in Haringey, for example, this hypothetical family would have to pay £2,288 a year, worth over £6,000 in real terms today, compared with only £572 for the billionaire. The previous system, domestic rates, was based on households paying a single rate based on the rental value of their home, so a billionaire in a mansion would pay much higher rates than our example household of 4. The current system of council tax is more similar to the old system. It's based on households paying a single rate, but this time based on the sale value of their home. So again, our billionaire would pay higher rates than our family of four. In Haringey, that was £1,363 a year when it was first introduced, with a family in an average flat paying £484 to £665. The council tax is still a regressive tax because it's not proportional to people's ability to pay. However, it is a lot less bad than the poll tax. So claiming they're the same is not only wrong, but it does a real disservice to one of the most important working class movements in British history and all of the millions of people who participated. With the poll tax defeated, Dave and other grassroots activists tried to strategize about how they could keep momentum going to take on other issues in their communities.
So as the anti-poll tax campaigning began to wane, the necessity for it, we in Haringey were saying, well, how can we build on this? How can we learn from what we've achieved? And we encouraged anti-poll tax groups to transform into general solidarity organisations, supporting a wide range of campaigns, supporting industrial disputes, supporting, claimants and struggles and whatever in local areas, because that's really what's needed, is ongoing solidarity and mutual aid and support for protests for making society better. That's what we did in Haringey. All the groups transformed into solidarity groups and then eventually coalesced into one Haringey Solidarity Group, which still exists today. So we've carried on having monthly meetings since 1992. And we've supported a wide range of different movements, not just campaigns, but also initiatives, independent cinema. We do a newsletter, which we distribute for free to the public. And we've initiated various different housing action groups and so on. So I don't know if the same thing happened anywhere else in the UK, but certainly it's something essential that every area needs, every area in the world needs. That there's a network of support for challenging those in power and supporting each other and trying to make society better. So I think that's the lesson in real life that we learned from that movement. But the lesson, I think, the wider lesson is that people power is unstoppable if it has enough kind of public involvement and public support.
Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire.
That brings us to the end of this double episode. But we've got a great bonus episode where Dave talks more about some of the different left strategies within the campaign, how protesters organised the October 1990 demo to monitor the police and push back against their lies, and about the activities of the Haringey Solidarity Group. This is available for our supporters on Patreon who make our work possible. It does take a lot of time and money making these podcasts and running the rest of the Working Class History Project, researching stories and reaching an audience of between 15 and 25 million a month. So if you do appreciate our work, please do sign up to support us and listen to that bonus content now. Just go to patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. If you don't have the money right now, absolutely no problem. But please help us get the word out about this podcast. Tell your friends and colleagues about it, and take a second to give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app, like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. As always, we've got more information, sources, and eventually a transcript on the webpage for this episode. Link in the show notes. One of the main sources we've used for these episodes is the excellent book Poll Tax Rebellion by Danny Burns. You can get hold of it on the link in the show notes. Thanks to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Jazz Hands, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, Nick Williams, and Old Norm. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it on the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by Engin Hassan. Thanks for listening, and catch you next time.
Del partigiano morto per la libertà.